What is up, guys? Welcome back to day 2, round 3 of the Vasilis Theodoridis International Chess Tournament here in Kavala, Greece. My name is Titus Tromavicius, I'm a Grandmaster, and I want to share my experiences and games with you from the event. So currently I have on the screen the pairings and results from round 2, and as you can see I managed to win my round 2 game. So I start with 2 out of 2. The upsets kept pouring in, lots of high-rated players failing to win their respective games in round 2 as well. But I am still part of the leading pack with 2 out of 2. And in round 3, I have the white pieces against a talented junior player from Colombia. Um, uh, we both start with 2 out of 2. My opponent is Campos Manuel, a FIDE master, rated 2316. And it is a second round of a double round day. So I didn't have that much time to prepare, but I did notice my opponent was playing mostly the Slav setup against high-rated players with the black pieces. So for me, it was really a no-brainer to go for an exchange Slav, which is more or less my main method of choice to play against the Slav these days. And I feel like I've scored relatively well in these structures, or at least had relatively good positions for the most part. Spoiler: it's not gonna go this way this game, but yeah. So I felt like this was a natural choice, especially being the second round of the day. Bishop f4, knight c6, e3, knight f6, knight c3, and we have sort of a standard setup at the moment, where black has two main options for the most part, which is a6 and bishop f5. Also, bishop g4 usually has the same sort of denomination as bishop f5 as well, because usually white will play queen d3 and transpose the same lines that are very well known and played hundreds of times. My opponent decides to play for a6, and recently I've sort of uncorked a new idea to me, which wasn't really a new idea in itself, but my coach sort of suggested me to try this bishop e2 line, basically to prevent the bishop g4 mainline theory that has been sort of a little bit dry in the recent years and recent games. And by far the most played move is bishop f5, and now white I would have had a choice between g4 and knight f3. I'm not going to reveal which one I had prepared for this game. Maybe an indicator what I did in the game could be how I played after my opponent played a different move. But usually, yeah, those are the two main moves after bishop f5. But my opponent surprises me immediately after thinking for maybe 15 minutes or so. Decides to play queen b6. And initially I thought this move made absolutely no sense because I felt like I was well developed and the pawn wasn't really hanging on b2 potentially anyway. I checked my file and queen b6 was not even looked at, the file that I had on my computer. It definitely is a pretty rare move. Check the games in the database as well. Not that many games of queen b6. Surprisingly enough, I saw my countryman play it in the Olympiad when I was part of the team as well. But I actually sat out the match, so I couldn't remember the game. But he decided to play for queen b6. His opponent played queen b3, which was not a great move because obviously after queen b3 and a b3, you double your own pawns as white, and you generally don't want to do that as you're the one trying to play for a similar type of an advantage. But of course, a3 I think is the most natural, obviously, to prevent the capture on b2 indirectly because of knight a4. So my opponent now plays bishop f5. And here I started thinking. I think I spent maybe 25 minutes for the next couple of moves each. So I really sank into deep think because I saw, a simple sort of development strategy that I could employ. Play for something like knight a4. My opponent would have to draw back, play for like rook c1 or something. That made me play for queen b3. And I thought this was all well and good and a slight advantage for me, but I really couldn't see anything sort of more forcing. And I felt like my opponent has already misplayed the position quite a bit with this early queen b6. So I was trying to find something a little bit more. After thinking for a long time and I wasn't really satisfied with the knight a4 rook c1 ideas, I decided to go for g4. My main sort of thought that was that my opponent will have to take the pawn on g4 and play for some queen b2 trickery. And I was pretty satisfied with the positions that I was going to get there. Let's say, bishop g4, bishop g4, I believe I was thinking knight g4, and now if queen g4, my opponent would take on b2. So I can't really do that, but I have other options. I can take on d5, for example, threatening knight c7, so my opponent has to play queen a5, knight c3, and I've, captured a center pawn for a more of an offside pawn that my opponent has captured, and I should be quite a bit better. My opponent basically blitzes out bishop g6, which completely caught me off guard. Again, a general rule of thumb is you shouldn't really spend that much time in the opening in the first place. And usually long things tend to lead to oversights, easy oversights. Again, a natural move was definitely preferred to g4. And now I felt like I kind of had to, justify my sort of weakening move, an expansion move on the king side. And of course, g5 is no good because of knight e4, and again, knight d5, queen e5 check ideas, which is what I missed and why I didn't consider bishop g6 to be an option. So instead, I decided to play for knight e4, kind of, going back to the path that I should have went for in the first place. Queen d8, of course, is basically forced. And now, again, I decided to try and justify my g5 move, and instead of, doing a natural development move, let's say rook c1, I instead go for g5. Now this is already a step, again, sort of doubling down on the mistake that I made. And again, another good rule in chess is usually don't be afraid to admit your mistakes. And there is no shame in sort of admitting that and repeating the moves sometimes even. Or sort of, again, correcting your mistake in some shape or form. To counter that, there is also a saying that a bad plan is better than no plan. Whereas if you start shuffling pieces back and forth, it could appear like you have no plan. But you have to really pick and choose which strategy you want to apply to which case. And usually in the opening, you want to stay away from bad plans. So g5 was definitely g4 and g5 was just completely misguided and completely wrong in this sort of position. And after knight e4, I triple down on my mistakes and I play f3, which was one idea, of course, with this g4, g5 sort of expansion, as I thought my opponent, if he plays knight d6, now I can play knight c5 and no longer have to worry about my opponent's bishop capturing my knight on c5 at any sort of stage of the game. Instead, of course, however, my opponent thinks for 5 minutes and immediately plays e5, which I saw, but completely misevaluated its strength. I was kind of just being hopeful at this point that he was not going to play e5 after I played f3. But of course he does, because the move makes absolutely sense. It's completely natural. Now we're sort of already threading into territory which we didn't really want to get to when we started the game with an exchange Slav. To quadruple down on my mistake, instead of taking with the bishop and admitting that I've messed up and my position is borderline critical, I decide to take with the pawn. And after knight g5, already black is apparently much better according to the computer, and the position is definitely close to critical. To make matters even worse, I started miscalculating even further. As I went for queen b3, assuming that I could meet knight a5 with bishop b5 check, which just fails on so many levels. Like, my opponent has maybe 2-3 ways to actually parry this move, and by far the easiest one is just to take the bishop. And now he has 2 moves that apparently even win, which I didn't realize. I thought queen d7 was a no-go because of takes and knight b6 fork, but apparently after king c6, my knight will be trapped on a8, and knight b3 actually does the exact same sort of maneuver to my rook, forcing me to either play rook d1 and put the rook in sort of an unfavorable square where it's restricted by the enemy pieces, or to capture the knight on g5, and after knight e1, knight e2, bishop c5, my knight is the one being captured first, whereas the enemy knight can retreat at its leisure. Bishop b5 fails in that respect, and also it fails after the simple knight c6, and after queen b7, queen a5, and queen a4 would defend the knight on c6 the next move if it was to get captured. And if I play knight c3, knight d8 sort of keeps everything tidy and neat for black. Fortunately for me, After 95, I do have a move that sort of keeps me in the game, so to speak. I play queen b6, and it makes sense also in a way that when you're worse and your opponent has sort of these trumps, you definitely want to simplify that position, especially with the weakened king that I have. And queen b6 definitely makes a lot of sense, and I'm very lucky to have this move in this position, which keeps the game going. 96 makes a lot of sense, also to just sort of remove the knight from being attacked. Rook c1, sort of again eliminating these bishop c2 ideas that my opponent had potentially to undermine my knight. Bishop e7, knight h3. I'm trying to finish development with the only squares that I have for my pieces. D4, maybe a little bit premature. Maybe my opponent could have castled first, try to centralize his pieces, and then go for a pawn break. But definitely not a game-changing mistake. Black is still much better. And d3, I think, is maybe the step, the first sort of big misstep in Black's play so far. From getting a good position that he had, because what it does is basically eliminate the threats. It releases the tension in a way. Yes, you do create a pass pawn that's supported by all of your pieces, but also you eliminate your options in the future, such as d takes e3 and playing through the dark squares with your pieces. So d3 was definitely a little bit premature. Again, it's nice to sort of push a pawn to the third line and have it protected and supported by your pieces, but at the same time, if you don't have a direct follow-up, the pawn could become a weakness in the future. So bishop d4, obviously an only move. Bishop f5, knight f2, again, makes a lot of sense, just to bring the pieces closer to the center. Knight f4, finally, Black decides to take the two bishops and castles. And initially I thought my opponent missed rook c7. He seemed to kind of missed it, but not really. Computer says this is no big deal. Black has many ways to sort of deal with this, with the best being a very surprising bishop h4. I don't think this is a human move at all, but basically the idea is very simple. If you take, I play b5, and I undermine your sort of connection of the pieces as the pawn intervenes with the c5 square, where the rook could have retreated to guard the queen. And after, for example, knight c5, rook a7, the queen is pinned, and Black picks up an exchange at the end of the day. I do believe that actually White has maybe knight a6 here, but I think knight a6 doesn't really do anything. As I'm trying to think, maybe even bishop c8 is a move, but I'm sure there's other moves. Maybe queen d4. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly how Black would proceed here, but maybe just rook a6 actually. Yeah, rook a6, of course, easy move. Yeah, bishop h4 obviously not a very human move, but at the same time, it makes a lot of sense to play bishop h4 just to get the bishop out of the way of potential tactics involving rook takes e7. My opponent still plays the more natural and still very strong knight c6, and I do end up winning a pawn, which sort of is always a good thing when you're worse, to be up material at the very least. So you have at least some say that, I have at least a pawn up, My opponent has two bishops, he has the better pieces, he has, a passed pawn on the third line, but I still have a pawn up at least. So in the long run, if I manage to stabilize the position, I could have something to look forward to in the game. Rook b8 is forced, knight c4, knight d4 makes a lot of sense, centralizing your pieces. b4, just to get the pawn out of the way of the attack of the rook. And here the most natural move would have been to play rook c8 and try to infiltrate. And Black is, very close to achieving a full domination and successfully winning the game. My opponent decides to play a little bit more sort of restrained. But again, he was also kind of getting low on time. So it's not a good sign, right? Like if you're making backward moves in a position where you're pawn down and you have to play actively, it's already, a worrying sort of sign for my opponent's prospects in this game. I continue centralizing my pieces with knight e4. My main idea is to obviously bring the king closer to the pawn and eventually collect it. Now my opponent decides to play rook c8. Knight cd6 is one of the moves, rook c1. And now, according to the computer, the best move was f5. Forcing the issue sort of with knight f5 and this nice tactical shot bishop e2. And after, a computerish line, which is more or less forced, we end up in this endgame where it's 3 against 3 pawns with 3 minor pieces each. My opponent has the 2 bishops. I have the 2 passed pawns that are kind of threatening, but according to the engine, this game is more or less balanced. Black is maybe slightly preferred according to the engine, but the game is level. Instead, I played King f2, which again was my main idea to start with. I sort of, we were both getting low on time, so I just decided to kind of, create a direct threat of King e3 and see what my opponent does. And for my opponent, the best move was again a very counterintuitive bishop takes e4 to part ways with one of your bishops, but to play through the dark squares basically. And the main idea involves after King e3, Knight f5, and if King e3, Rook e3. We can see that the knight comes to e3 with devastating effect, and also b4 pawns is loose as well. So bishop e4 was a very sort of difficult move to spot, but obviously it makes sense when you see it and the lines that arise from it. Instead, my opponent played knight c2, which was the move I was expecting and I was calculating, and it's a very bad move actually, because it allows f5, and the bishop suddenly is running out of squares on the king side. My opponent has to throw in a check bishop h4 first, which doesn't really change the sort of the circumstances because I was going to play knight g3 anyway. And now I used more or less all of my remaining time here to try and understand if the position that we have is critical for me to respond quickly or not, basically. Because I saw this idea bishop e2, which I decided to play in the game. I wasn't sure if it was working completely because I thought my opponent had some options here, such as I believe I was thinking that he could, trying to think, was it rook f1? Yeah, I think it was rook f1. I was trying to work these things out, d2, bishop e2, knight d4. And after king e3, let's say bishop f3, or maybe first bishop g3, hg, and bishop f3. This was what I was calculating during the game, and I felt like I should be at least slightly better, even if, for example, I took on f3, knight f3, and king e2, because I have a far pass pawn potentially on the queen side, and I felt like I'm playing for, at the very least, 2 results. So I was quite happy with the situation, especially being low on time before the time control adds 30 minutes after 40 moves. Instead, my opponent played d2 quite quickly. I think he sort of felt like that was too dangerous for him. Maybe he saw some improvements for me as well along the way. And instead, we got a position with 2 knights against 2 bishops, but I do have a passed pawn, and I have, sort of a nice constriction over my opponent's king. My opponent's king is also very passive potentially in the endgame. We're still both low on time, with three moves to make. So I just decided to make a pass pawn as quickly as possible to immediately create again threats. When you're low on time, usually that's a good rule to follow is create threats and see if your opponent can respond properly to them, and immediately kind of cause your opponent problems. F6, trying to undermine the knight on d6 makes a lot of sense. B6, fe5, and now we made a time control. And as quite often happens, white is completely winning here, and the move I make unfortunately lets the advantage split up, and I only thought for about a minute. The move I played was knight g4, which unfortunately is not a good move in this position for a very concrete reason. The winning move was knight d4, basically getting the exact same position, but very importantly controlling the h1 square that the bishop cannot go to. As in the game, after knight g4, bishop d8, b7, bishop c7, king f2, bishop h1, exclamation mark, black keeps a tight grip of my knights. My both knights cannot really move right now. They're immobilized more or less because they're both attacked. And that was basically the reason why knight d4 was the winning move to prevent my opponent from playing bishop h1. And I would have got basically the exact same position that we got in the game, but a couple of moves faster, and a couple of moves faster means I would also have an extra pawn potentially. So now we proceed to more or less forced line, is what I would call it. After knight b5, bishop b8, knight c5, I'm trying knight e7, knight e6. I collect the bishop on b8, but now my knight is trapped on b8, and we get into an interesting position where I would say it's kind of a mutual zugzwang. where neither side really has any moves that improve their respective positions. So my opponent is forced to play g6 and trade my sort of weakish pawn on f5. With the idea being that if I play FG, again, my knights are kind of trapped. I have to sort of try to go around with king f2, but my opponent successfully centralizes his king, and these knights are not very good. These knights are not very good. So I am more or less forced to play f6 to give up a second pawn to get my knights out of the game, out into the game. And after knight e7, my opponent plays king g5 and offers me a draw. During the game, I thought king f5 was a very interesting move. A very committal move, but a very interesting move. Basically, after knight e6, asking me a couple of questions. First of all, is this position, after knight b7, king h3, winning or not? I believe it is winning, but I could be wrong. Let me just double check real quick. Yes, it is in fact winning, but we again get into territory that I am not very familiar with, and I don't think most people are familiar with and are not very comfortable with. But basically, the idea is that unfortunately for Black, after he captures the pawn on h2, his knight is his king is rather very poorly placed, and I believe we don't even get to those necessarily those positions with two knights against the pawn, but we get into a position where his king is very restricted, and I can just probably harass him to the corner and mate him in the corner with my two knights against two pawns. But it's obviously very tricky during the game, and again, in analysis, it looks much simpler than it actually is. So I thought king f5 was an interesting try. I also thought knight e6, king e6 was an interesting try to sort of simplify this position, in such a way. I do believe this position is winning according to the engine, but it's definitely far from trivial because my opponent's king is again going to get very active. These pawns are going to start pushing, and basically, Black manages to push his pawns far enough, the game will end in a draw very, very quickly. But my opponent does decide to play king g5. He decides to offer me a draw. I think it's kind of I wouldn't necessarily say it's unethical to offer a draw when you're a piece down and you have no chances of winning, but definitely something I always frown upon when someone offers a draw in such a position. And I decide to, of course, decline the draw and play knight e5, king h4, knight f2, king h3, king g1 rather, sorry, and I defend the pawn in time. And of course, the position is objectively equal, but I'm a piece up, and my opponent can definitely still get into trouble potentially with me being a piece up. Knight e6, bishop a8, a very, very logical move. I'm actually in this position already. For example, there's only two moves that draw the position, which, I mean, it seems quite surprising to me personally. But bishop a8 is in fact one of them. And after knight f5, I believe my opponent kind of lost the sense of danger completely and played h5. And h5 is actually already a losing move. White is winning. I didn't see it right off the top of the, immediately basically. I played knight g7 because I saw that knight g7 wins after every move except for king h4. So I have to repeat once. I just opted to repeat once. And after knight g3, king h4, now I can go around the other way and play knight d7. And again, I was trying to work out the details. For example, if my opponent played bishop c6, knight f6, bishop f3, king f2, king h3, king f3, king h2, is this winning? Apparently this is mate in like 15 or something. Again, we don't get into these positions where you take the pawn. This actually would be a terrible move. But instead, you go for a knight e2 setup where you confine the enemy king in this little box, and eventually these pawns will advance and limit his own king's sort of mobility, and Black will end up getting mated in the corner. Again, looks quite simple and easy in analysis, but during the game I was completely unsure. Instead, my opponent played bishop f3 immediately, which I thought made my task even easier, sort of, whereas I just attacked the pawn, and basically my opponent has no way to defend it. After, let's say, bishop d1, I thought the simplest is just to play king g2 and eliminate the final sort of moves from my opponent's bishop and collect the pawn on h5. And the rest is not even a matter of technique, it's just a matter of patience and not blundering anything in one move. And the game lasted still for about 30 moves, but didn't really change anything. And we can just scroll through this. My opponent played till mate. Definitely frustrated with how the game went for him, of course, so it's understandable. But nonetheless, I do emerge victorious with 3 out of 3. So couple of key takeaways from this game. Number one, develop your pieces in the opening. That's I see the sort of the trend of my last two videos, developing. And number two is knights are very sluggish and hard, and trade your knights, basically, is what I'm trying to say, if you can. The sooner the better. So 3 out of 3. Game 4 has already been played. I'm gonna record a video for that and probably post it in the evening today, maybe in the morning tomorrow. We'll see. Still have some catch up to do there. Probably in the evening today. I will do the video. So 3 out of 3, still part of the leaders. Check out the game for recap that's gonna be in the evening, and I'll see you then.